I wanted to say something about the complaint that Georges made that we didn't give any instructions, and it reminded me of something that often happens to me when I'm teaching, which is that students will come in and say, "Well, what am I supposed to write my paper about? You didn't assign a paper topic." And I say, yes, that's quite right. I didn't assign a paper topic. So that's exactly what Bob and I did on purpose, was to really leave things, aside from the general description we had of the conference, to really leave things as open as possible so that people could respond in a way that wasn't actually set by thoughts that we had about what they should say, other than, of course, the conference description. And at least for myself, I feel that that's actually worked quite well, because we've had really an incredibly rich range of responses and thoughts in the morning and in the afternoon. And it makes me actually feel sort of somewhat at a loss as to know, where we should begin in this discussion that we're going to have this afternoon. But a couple of things struck me. There's a sort of recency effect in that, what's resonating in my mind right now are, of course, the more recent talks this afternoon than the ones that we began with. So I don't want to lose sight of those. But one of the things that struck me was a kind of juxtaposition of Thomas's saying, cognitive science can take care of itself, but it would be good if cognitive scientists practiced meditation more. So I'm interested in that as something that the cognitive scientists might comment on, but I also find that quite striking in relationship to what Bob said, which was exactly the opposite in a way, which is, no, that's not really what should be going on. We should be drawing on a certain lineage of thought in Buddhism that he was identifying as critical Buddhism. And then most recently, we've seen in the last talk this really wonderful reminder that science is actually incredibly rich and complex in terms of its sources, its methods, its self-understanding of what it's doing, its vision of itself as an investigative project, and something that Thomas didn't actually mention, but that he's going to be talking about, I believe, in the Townsend talk, or one of the talks maybe, is the idea that science itself has roots, deep roots, in a Western self-understanding of science as itself a spiritual practice or a spiritual, and you use the word spiritual, that's why I'm using it. And so this was something you didn't mention, but I think it would be very interesting to bring that into the discussion, particularly as you have talked about it in that article, in relationship to the most recent remarks by John. So these are very kind of free associative thoughts that I had in response to particularly some of the more recent remarks. And I don't want to lose sight of some of the other things that were said, particularly that have to do with the ways that Dan and Christian are presenting Buddhism as confronting a certain problem of consciousness, which is very much how we are approaching Buddhism given certain current philosophical and scientific interests, and they're taking different perspectives on that. So that's also something I think that we might want to take up here. So those are my immediate responses, but I think it would be interesting actually to hear from some of the cognitive scientists whether this proposal, what they think of this proposal. I think that's, so the proposal to go do some meditation.
Okay, I know you're trying to get me to take that one
I am trying to get you.
Well, I guess I would say practice what more? I mean, why wouldn't they not, practice music or dance improvisation or many different forms of meditation or yoga? And that takes me kind of back to your remark that I more or less agree with, that cognitive science can take care of itself, in that most cognitive scientists I know do practice some form or other of music, dance, yoga, meditation. But I don't know if you're suggesting that they should sort of practice, some sort of unified or particular Buddhist practice, or simply practice something?
Well, of course, I have my particular conditioned intuition of what would be good for them. It's basically some sort of vipassana. But the general idea is just not to get, let me not go too far. I really recognize good scholarship if it's there, and I really admire all this work on Buddhist philosophy. I've seen a lot of brilliant stuff here, and it's valuable. It should be done. But I guess in this current tricky situation where everything becomes very superficial, I don't know. Here I perceive this sugar-coated mindfulness thing. In Germany, it's more something we call wellness spirituality, It just has to do with being very healthy and superficial at the same time. The thing derails somehow. It's taking on a strange momentum and a strange direction. And I think my intuition is just basically, not a big argument, but that cognitive science and analytical philosophy of mind would just become so much better if people wouldn't talk about it, but if a considerable amount of people would really practice. And I'm also a pessimist. This may sound starry-eyed, but my experience with my colleagues, philosophers, is that they are extremely egocentric people. They want to make a career, they want tenure, they are what I call career soldiers in my own mind. They will not do this unless there's an incentive for it. And that's the actual problem. Go ahead.
Do you think that doing Vipassana is going to make them less egocentric? and if so, what is the data there?
Okay. But that was actually a criticism that could be empirically decided. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're right. But we could have a large study. Will they become less egocentric or ruin their academic careers and disappear into silence or something like this? So are you saying it's probably false? They could operate just like they operate right now?
Well, what I would suggest is that this could easily be demonstrated by serious ethnographies within Asian monasteries where meditation is practiced. And there you will find at least many of us who have hung out in such places having serious doubts whether the object there is a certain, what we would identify as egolessness. You just have to look at the teachers.
I'm sorry, I don't think that's fair. That's a little too far, honestly.
Yeah, I don't want to get in the middle between John and responses. One is, I think we should remember often the childhood experiences of people who go on to become scientists are often filled with an extraordinary, awestruck view of the natural world and a very foregrounded curiosity about the way things work. And if one has a predilection for thinking about how one works as a mind, then one is naturally, potentially beginning to pay attention to experience as an unfolding process quite early on in life. And that interest can mature with a whole variety of practices. So some might involve movement, some might involve, contemplative practice. It depends on a whole host of, what you bounce into at what time and what history. So,
let me be a little bit more, a little bit more specific. What I'm making this up, I admit, and it's late in the afternoon. But I think, and again, I'm talking about East Asian monasteries. But I'm not suggesting that doing Vipassana makes one more egotistical. I am suggesting that as you rise through the ranks of monastic hierarchies, just the way as you rise the ranks through academic hierarchies, there's a tendency for some people to become more full of themselves.
Sure.
What is interesting is that, and you get egotistical masters and non-egotistical masters. What is interesting is that on the face of it, it is not clear that Vipassana or Buddhist meditation, forget Vipassana, whatever meditation they're doing, and many of them are meditating a lot, that it's mitigating those institutional and social effects.
This is I agree with Thomas, this is a very strong empirical question, and it is conditioned by all kinds of cultural, hierarchical progression. In a monastic situation, it may be a little different in the West. I can tell you that in terms of our research group, there is a circulation between doing practice and retreat experience that has been materially informative for experimental design.
Yes, but remember that in the West, you can't, what I'm saying is there's a cultural difference between Asia and the West. And I'm sure there are cultural differences between Tibet and China and Japan. But in the West, when people are doing Vipassana, they are told that the goal is to become less egotistical.
Yeah, so there is all of the
Right.
prepackaging,
Yeah.
all of the way in which this is presented that's already made friendly to a lot of, Calvinist ethical assumptions of Western culture.
What that means is that the Asian monastic communities provide a very interesting, maybe not a control group, but they provide an interesting contrast to see what is operative, what is causally operative.
This could be true.
I would just say that my experience of Asian monastic context is very different. And I would not say that it would be typically the case in a Tibetan monastic context that the higher you rose in the ranks, the more egotistical you would appear, since you would be guaranteed to not rise. That's just a cultural norm, right? So there may be, of course, there would be cultural differences. But another way of saying it that is just to note that in the Tibetan cultural context, the guaranteed way to prove that you don't deserve promotion is to say that you deserve promotion. It's just a cultural norm. So, but what I think just the one way I think in some ways there's an aspect of this conversation which is at times ad hominem and at times hardly speculative, that I want to go back to what both of these gentlemen have proposed, which is simply that a lot of these questions could be answered empirically. And part of what we need and what can emerge out of the conversation is what kinds of empirical research do we need? And clearly, part of what we need is definitely better ethnographic study of contemplative practice in Asia, better ethnographic study of contemplative practice outside of Asia, and then measures of issues that we think are important. Whether we can have a measure of self-centeredness, or certainly there are measures out there of generosity and so on. These are things that we can decide would be worthwhile. But a lot of it does need to, I think it's better to, in a sense, delay this, or simply point out what could be empirically answered and leave it at that to a certain extent.
And just to say that my own experience that at the Mind on Life Institute, one of the most powerful moments has always been the day of practice in silence. That all of scientists, I always sense a shift in the quality of the dialogue and also the interpersonal relationship with the practitioner that will be, and that has been shared by many, and that really suggests that I think you probably. If I have to speculate, you're probably right to some degree, I think, Thomas, because that's always been the case that's something happened for scientists when they start to practice for one day, and so just to make that more explicit, again, I think for me it's come to this notion of the tendency that we have to reify things, and there is the cultivation of a letting go of some sort is a way to take distance with all the concepts that we're manipulating. So I think that in that sense, for scientists, it's very useful as a practice to let go of their own conceptualization. So as a process, I think it would be useful for the scientific enterprise if you learn this skill, the skill to let go of scientific ideas.
2 points. I think there are a lot of meditative practices in science, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people about Zen and the art of pipetting. I kid you not. Literally last week with 2 other scientists as we were walking to the parking deck. The practice of science in many ways is very tedious and repetitive. It requires concentration. Many people resist automation of their procedures in order to have that embodied engagement with the medium of knowledge production. And it's a way of thinking continuously about what can go wrong. So it's like you're all the time looking at the frailty of what you're producing because, and I'm sure anybody who's done this kind of work is keenly aware of that because things can screw up all the time. And those moments of screwing up can be deeply informative or just plain disastrous, right? And so that's the thing that we try to sort out. So I'm not saying that empiricists should not or that scientists should not engage in practice, but I do think that coming out of the closet about science as practice, and that in many ways, what I think not just I, but many of my science friends think of as the best scientists are the ones who are deeply reflexive about the basis of not just what they know, but what they don't know, and the production of knowledge, and continuously thinking about, for every discovery, it's like, aha, I just found something. The most important thought is, why is this wrong? What can I do to figure out how to destabilize that observation? So that's one. And then the other, briefly, is just that you're touching on something that has been a real challenge, and Laurence and I were sort of talking on the side a bit, for anthropology, because participant observation and how far you go native is a huge issue, because you don't go to the Trobrians, as Malinowski did, and go that far native to retain your credibility. And yet on another level, he might claim that some of his deeper insights were by going that native. So I'd like to point to that tension as well, and that it may not be important to have a requirement, but to be that you practice or not practice, or you go native or you don't go native, but to be very aware of your positionality vis-a-vis the inquiry that you're engaging in.
Could I just say a quick thing here? In response to Thomas's call for scientists to practice more, I should, at least some of the philosophers at this table would say that theory too is a kind of practice, right? That the kind of reflexivity that we engaged in when we examine our presuppositions and so on, that is a form of practice. So I'm not quite sure exactly what it's meant when the word practice is used beyond that. So if anyone could explain exactly what that means, that'll be great.
I don't think this speaks exactly to the kind of practice that Thomas is talking about, but I do think that there are 2 things that are interesting for me in this notion of practice. One is a shift away from the constructs one's working with. To the extent, this point was made many times today, to the extent that you're very invested in a particular frame, and this is your career, this is your cultural capital, and so on. It's very hard to stand back and look at it critically and generate new things. So whatever will help with that is important, whether it's a very general and far-reaching kind of distancing from things and looking at them, or whether it's a more deliberate theoretical kind of discipline. But the other is more social again, and it's when you look at these 2 spaces and you realize that people are being called upon to be different facets of their potential selves together with each other in different kind of community. And I find this very interesting in terms of my own teaching activities, because I do believe as a scientist, as a researcher, you need to care about what you're doing. You need to have the reasons why it matters to you and so on. But I think it's extraordinarily important to try to be very open and honest about that with yourself and with other people in terms of why this matters to you. And so creating spaces where something like that can happen, where people are not downplaying that or trying to to deflect that because it's too personal, let's say, and they want to, maintain the aura of objectivity. I see that as something else that can happen in this kind of milieu because people, in a way, are doing a kind of practice that strips them down a little bit to their own levels of physical comfort and discomfort, their own feelings of orientation, disorientation, and so on. So it's going to lead to a certain kind of communitas, a certain kind of breaking down of barriers between people that I think is an interesting process for people who otherwise are presenting themselves in a kind of academically shaped and perhaps defended position vis-a-vis ideas.
I would just weigh in support of Christian's point and elaborate it a little bit by making the point that the word probably most often translated as meditation in Sanskrit Buddhist texts is bhavana, which is the nominal form from a causative form of the verb to be. So it just means to make real, to make actual. And all manner of practices within the tradition are understood as continuous with that aim. To make real is simply to make vivid. So the thought is you need to take the insights of the tradition and not simply assent to them, not simply learn to reproduce the arguments, but to make the conclusions vivid. And I think that studying texts of the tradition is among the practices they engage in. So I would add that to the point that's also made, Bob made it in his talk along the way, that in fact most Buddhists historically have not meditated, even in monasteries.
Thomas is mysteriously silent, but maybe that's part of the point. He's practicing. So I'll just guess, and then you can correct me. Or do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Well, let me just confess or admit a point, concede a point. That's the word. For if I say something like it might be good to have more, whatever, Vipassana-like practice in science. This is, of course, theory contaminated. And I see very clearly that in the end, I would need a theory of meditation to give good reasons for what kind of practice would be best to combine with straight science. I concede that point. But can we do that without it getting too deep into intellectual universes we create?
Actually, one of the texts most explicitly on the category of bhavana, the bhavana krama texts of Kamalashila, one of the points he makes in that is that you have to do philosophy because you have to get clear on what view it is that you're cultivating. Cultivation is my preferred translation of bhavana. And his thought is you can make any philosophical view vividly real. So you'd better start with the right one, because his thought is if you subject to bhavana, to the process of making vividly real a mistaken view, you can just as well go off the rails as help yourself. So he thinks of the process of thinking critically about the tradition's claims and making them one's own intellectually as a necessary part of the process.
Although one would want to point out that there are other opinions in which that would be
but they may be
that
wrong.
would be the mistaken process. But what I would say further, which I would just raise as a question to the cognitive scientists here, is whether part of what I hear the implication in your proposal, Tomas, is that there might be utility, and maybe actually the point is maybe cognitive scientists just do this anyway. But supposing I were a cognitive scientist interested in emotions or in visual perception, that I could imagine there might be a standpoint in which I think everything that's important about visual perception, or everything that I think is important about emotions, is below any kind of phenomenally accessible or conscious level. So there's no point in me doing any kind of practice that would make it such that I would sit there and somehow observe my own visual perception or emotions. So that might block my interest. But on the other hand, I might think that there is a real utility to me developing a very disciplined process, some way of trying to observe the way from my own standpoint the visual perception is arising, or to observe the way in which my emotions are arising, maybe even try to deliberately invoke certain types of emotional states in myself, so as to give me some ideas about how I might proceed in my own research agenda. And I'm just curious in terms of the scientists whether in cognitive science in general? Do people who work in visual perception sort of spend some time, maybe hours at a time on certain occasions, where they really try to do a disciplined observation of visual perception from their own standpoint? Or is the notion that this is everything that's important is below that level, so there's no point in spending any time on that?
I mean, first of all, I would agree with a number of people's comments, Carol's and the two Johns and Cliff's, that scientists spend a tremendous amount of time studying their introspective, their phenomenological experience, and getting a tremendous amount of inspiration and ideas from their experience. And I think a lot of the best psychologists are the best at doing this. I think another thing that's often not acknowledged nearly as much as it should be is that when we are collecting, say, behavioral or neuroscience measurements, that our participants are having conscious phenomenological experiences as well that we sometimes measure and incorporate into our interpretation of the more third-person measurements. And even when we don't formally incorporate some kind of subjective self-report, we may be talking with them, we may be drawing inferences about what their subjective experience is. So to view what's going on in these sciences as purely third-person objective measurement, I think is really fairly naive, because there is so much incorporation of phenomenological experience, both from the perspective of the experimenter and from the participants. Having said that, I think John's right on the money. There's been a revolution in the last 20 years of psychological and brain sciences, of realizing how limited self-report is, and there's just a tremendous literature now showing that how wrong people's intuitions about what's causing their behavior and what they're doing can be, how limited self-report is, and how self-report can be biased by all sorts of factors. And there are really interesting theories about kind of what conscious experience is serving in humans, like that it plays these roles in social identity and social communication. I think Roy Baumeister actually has some great ideas about this. And that there is another system that is largely unconscious, like what people often refer to as System 1, which you could review as kind of karmic conditioning to a large extent, which is largely controlling our behavior unconsciously in ways that we don't have access to. And psychologists have kind of become increasingly aware of this, and when they try to figure out what is controlling behavior, I think they're often drawing on very different intuitions than their conscious experience in order to figure out what these unconscious causal processes are doing. So I think you kind of have both kinds of exploration and search happening at the same time. On the one hand, drawing from phenomenology, but on the other hand, just trying to think about how organisms work, taking maybe a more biological perspective, and just trying to understand the causal forces that are actually impacting people's behavior.
But I mean, as a working scientist, do you feel like that call for discipline, some kind of disciplined practice of observation of, let's say, whatever it might be that one is interested in terms of visual experience or emotion, or is that just seen as somehow, you're saying that it's not, that wouldn't be that useful?
I mean, I think it could potentially be, but I think there's so many possible ways that it happens. And I think in the area of contemplative science, I mean, I think most of the people I know who do contemplative science have a practice, as Cliff was saying. I mean, I think I guess I disagree with what John was saying about what happens at the Summer Research Institute. Sometimes there are people who just don't get what each of the other side is doing, but I think a lot of people go there to kind of put it together. I mean, a lot of scientists go there to develop a practice and to figure out how to integrate their practice with their scientific work. And so I think already people are doing what Thomas has suggested. I think a lot of people, especially in this area, are trying to develop a practice that will inform their scientific research.
I just want to mention that there are some specific instances where very important neuroscientific advances have come from the informed intuition cultivated through practicing Vipassana of influential neuroscientists, which have resulted in work that has been extremely influential, particularly work Amos Ariely in terms of neural context, how the ongoing brain activity just prior to a moment of perception actually can account for a tremendous amount of the event-related potential that is subsequently evoked. So it depends that much of self-report is naive and folk psychologically misguided, but at some level, I want to say the right hands, but I don't know what the term is, in the right mind, with the right mindset. there can be synthetic insights that really map mechanisms below the level of awareness in a conscious insight.
I want to say something about that. I think that's a really important point, especially from a historical perspective with regard to the history of psychology. Because if you look at major important milestones works in the history of psychology, they have a tremendous amount of phenomenological content. So, if you read Mach's analysis of sensations, or you read writings by Helmholtz, or you read all of the Gestalt psychologists writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, even though Gibson wouldn't use the word phenomenology, if you read Gibson's writings on visual perception, it's full of phenomenology. So or another example would be Endel Tulving's work on memory, which is just, hugely influential in terms of how we think about memory. It's full of phenomenology. So I think what's happening now in the case of that illustration is an enlargement of the space of phenomenological possibilities coming about through certain kinds of practices that I would want to conceptualize not in the introspectionist way, but in the enactive way that I was describing yesterday. They open up the phenomenological space, and when you do that, you facilitate things like insight and insight problem solving and creativity and all the things that, really is the sort of deep psychic soul of science, as it were, that really kind of keeps science moving, or any intellectual endeavor for that matter. So I think it's really important not to lose sight of how deep phenomenology is in science in those ways. The other thing I wanted to say, just coming back to the point about practice that Christian made, and here more speaking as a philosopher, philosophy was originally in the ancient world a kind of practice. It was, in fact, and this connects to something Thomas said about death denial. In fact, Plato defines philosophy as a practice for dying. It's a preparation for death. And this is hugely important in the world of Hellenistic philosophy and Stoicism, that there are certain practices that are reflective, contemplative, that have to do with cultivating equanimity in the face of that which you can't control. And of course, the ultimate thing you can't control is when and how you're going to die. Now, modern philosophy has completely lost sight of that because it's become concerned with mainly epistemological issues. And much as I am very modern in the way that I do philosophy and think about it in a Kantian, transcendental, theoretical, epistemological way, I actually think that one of the things that's very interesting to work with as a philosopher is to try to not to go back to something that was in the past, because you can't go back in that way, but to try to take that ancient sense of philosophy and bring it back to life, but in a modern critical epistemological way, so that we re-enliven that sense of philosophy as a contemplative practice, as something that is very much about how we live our life and how we face things like death and illness and suffering and the things that are, central to the Buddhist vision of the world. So this is something that, is not sort of worked out for me in any way that I could articulate. It's much more a kind of, guiding impulse or intuition or sensibility that I have as a philosopher, that it's important to connect those things in a way that was lost sight of in the modern evolution of philosophy. And for me, actually, ancient philosophy across the ancient world. So here I see, India and Greece actually have a lot more in common with each other in some ways on this particular point than, say, India and modern epistemology. So that's another example of a kind of, I don't know what to call it, a kind of hybridization maybe of different ways of knowing that I see coming up in this I won't say the word dialogue, but in this encounter, actually.
If I could just mention one really petty academic squabble along the lines of what Evan just mentioned. We've been talking about cognitive science in relation to philosophy, in relation to Buddhism, but no one's mentioned the continental analytic divide. And your comments just make me think of various aspects of continental philosophy, but especially in the French tradition, thinking about Bachelard, who is kind of the patron saint of philosophy of science in France. And he's informed by deep study of science, but also phenomenology. And his instructions to every philosopher and to every scientist, it's taught in high schools, right? Everyone has to read this in France. His instruction is self-examination, understanding what your presuppositions are, understanding what you're bringing to any epistemological question. And that's not just in science, that's kind of across the spectrum of life experiences. That developed into a tradition in French philosophy which became very much about the critical study of the life world. It became, Canguilhem, Foucault, Bourdieu are all deeply invested in the idea of philosophy being self-examination, but also examination of the structures, the social structures that shape the conditioning of the mind. So philosophy as such doesn't ban it. Modern philosophy as such doesn't ban it, this kind of introspection and awareness of those kinds of contexts, but the analytic tradition does. So that's my petty squabble to reintroduce.
So I have the sense that might be a good moment to open it up to general questions. So I'll travel around with the mic if I see hands. All right. See a salient blue shirt with a hand go up here. Also biased because he happens to be a student of mine.
So I'm just interested in this sort of exchange that happened between Thomas's comments and then the sort of philosophy as a form of practice. I think one sort of pushback that can come out of the sort of practice that I'm intuiting that Thomas was trying to push was that there's kind of a threshold of awareness that we have, and that it's kind of narrow, right? There's a lot going on beneath the surface of what we can consciously pay attention to, and you can't really think your way out of it, right? Like you can't really infer a lot of the solutions to the problems that the subconscious mind presents conscious attention with. But you can definitely reorganize your habits of attention by shutting up for a little while and paying attention to what's going on in the threshold of your body in a really detailed way. And I take it that was the point that Thomas was making, that it was like, no, we can't just talk at each other all the time. We have to be really quiet and pay attention to all the affective bias that's conditioning our attention and stop that a little bit and be nicer to each other. And if we do that, we'll get a lot more done. And so I take it that was the point. And if that's the point, then I think that there is kind of an anti-intellectualism about it. We can't come up with arguments to solve that problem. You have to change how you experience your body and how you feel around others and how you talk to them. And there's no logic for that. That's an internal project. So that was what I don't know if that's a faithful reconstruction of the view, but that's an attempt anyway.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's certainly right that our high-level, self-conscious, rigorous reflection on things is very far from exhausting our mental, spiritual lives and being. But I would rejoin with the point that what you discover in trying to hack the body systems and what kinds of changes you effect will be at least partly a function also of what you bring to the exercise, including what you think. And that was, I think, Kamalashila's cautionary point that you can, through practice, cultivate all manner of habits, but choosing which habits you want to cultivate is at least partly a function of reasoning as well.
Could I just interject for a sec? I think one place where there may be some common ground is to think of practices in terms of undermining the natural attitude. I think this is something where a certain kind of philosophy, a kind of existentially engaged philosophy, a certain kind of thoughtful cognitive neuroscience, any kind of real thoughtful considerations of how the perceptual systems work, certainly are attempts or predicated upon denaturalizing, or the natural attitude toward things. One way to understand Vipassana and some of the contemporary traditions of meditation that have arisen in the 20th century is that they were developed for lay people who were not immersed in Buddhist thought. and therefore they were they were kind of quick and dirty technique to undermine the natural attitude without having them go through the complicated procedures that were involved in a full-blown kind of reorientation that was, that was really the object of monastic practice. So in that sense, there may be common ground. The concern would be in thinking that there was something essential about these modernist practices, that they were somehow the heart of what was going on in the old monastic system. It was just sort of the first step, which is a certain kind of, again, undermining the natural attitude. But then there was all that work that went on to rebuild, constructively rebuild our understanding of the world such that it came into sync with the way the world really is. And of course, they believe they know the way the world really is. That's where you really begin to part ways soteriologically.
There's been lots put on the table. I've learned a lot. There are two propositions that came up, which I'd like to endorse, and then a question. First is the, and I think it goes back to John's claims about what might be successful, even though I think one has to acknowledge that sometimes their systems are just incommensurable. Paradigms are incommensurable, and when they clash, one paradigm just has to give way to another paradigm. So you have that with Newtonian science and with Einsteinian relativity and so forth. Even though you could still send rockets up with Newtonian science, it's not going to be able to explain all the things that relativity came to explain. So sometimes people have to just recognize the two systems are incommensurable and that never the twain shall meet. And I kept thinking throughout this conference that Buddhism and cognitive science seem to be like those two incommensurable systems. They seem to be meeting, but then they completely fall apart. And my third question might illustrate why I think that. But the second one is about phenomenology. And it's just come up quite significantly. I think the importance of phenomenology, not just in the 19th century, early 20th century discussions and so forth, but in the present time with a lot of influence in aesthetics as well, work in aesthetics, following from Merleau-Ponty, but also the work of Ed Casey on memory, on there are three-part was a memory, imagination, and aesthetics. Probably brilliant sort of work that still goes on in phenomenology. Not really it's just about introspection or just looking at the mind inside, but in fact engaging with texts and lots of traditions as well. So I think the importance of phenomenology needs to be absolutely retained. Perhaps not so much in the case of Buddhism, that too in terms of the life world. But my problem and question, and as Bob said this number of times as well, is about the focus on meditation or the kind of perhaps meditational or the mindfulness and so forth that people are extracting from Buddhism. Well, for lots of other Indian philosophical schools, this doesn't even come up. I mean, there's this dhyana in maybe Yoga Sutras and so forth, but it's a small part. It's not the entire thing. Where does it come from in Indian philosophical traditions? Well, I think it comes from the shamanic traditions, from the Stoics and aesthetics and so forth, which are completely outside of the Indic system altogether. And there are lots of them in the Himalayas. They're running around there, and I wonder why we don't go strapping electrodes on their heads and see what's going on there. Why just in Buddhism? TM, of course, and all this has been done to some extent too, with transcendental meditation. Benson did that in Harvard. There is a what is it called, a neon or something here in Marin County, ions or something that is still continuing. But I'm not quite sure if that has anything to do with, and of course they do disclaim that it has anything to do with any of the religions and philosophical traditions and so forth. But why is it that within Buddhism they have picked up quote-unquote meditation, turn it into mindfulness, and that is sort of projected as the element of Buddhism with which science has to dialogue? Sort of puzzles me. Thank you.
Well, I mean, historically, one of the ground zero moments of this was the Naropa Institute in 1974, where there were Francisco was there in 75. This was the beginning of a certain dialogue. Gregory Bateson was teaching there. This is when Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein began teaching Vipassana practice in a context of a new Buddhist-infused university that Chogyam Trungpa created as a kind of proto-mind and life before mind and life. So there actually was, a positioning of critical individuals. It was infused with contact improv and with Buddhist poetics. Allen Ginsberg, it was incredibly, wonderfully fomentive. And I popped into this because I was a sickly kid watching my breath, being asthmatic, knowing nothing about Buddhism. But when I came upon it informally, it registered that I think I can recognize I've been doing something like that. So for me, this is all accident of personal history and a moment in the culture. But everybody has their own particular story, but it does have some institutional background.
Sorry. There is a whole history around the way that mindfulness emerges as the banner of Buddhism in the West, or in Euro-America to be more accurate, and also the way in which that then becomes the focus of a lot of research. And some of that is very much funding driven through various institutions, but a lot of it actually public funding because of the perceived importance of mindfulness for clinical reasons. However, a lot of the research that's been done by people up here is actually not on mindfulness. In fact, it's on other types of meditation. So it's a bit of a misperception to think that mindfulness is certainly not the only style of Buddhist meditation that's been studied, and arguably maybe not even the one that's driven the most influential research. So in terms of the history of mindfulness and the way in which it becomes the banner for Buddhism, I'd highly recommend David McMahon's work, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, as one source. Ann Harrington and I have a forthcoming article in the American Psychologist on this issue. What am I forgetting? There are other sources as well that don't come to mind, so you can catch me after if you like. So there's a whole story behind that, right? It is not the standard. You wouldn't go to a Buddhist text, an Indian Buddhist text, and find mindfulness either presented in the way that it usually is presented now in modernity, or you'll find some texts that will do something like that, but most don't. And nor will you find mindfulness presented as the be-all and end-all, or even the main practice of all Indian Buddhist traditions. So it's a recent development.
And if I can just give a personal story that really go in the direction of John, is that at some point I got a award, an NIH grant, and but I was just on the edge to be funded, and so they flew me to NIH, and then they pretty much explained to me that if I wanted to get the grant, I had to study mindfulness. MBSR, mindfulness-based, and I was arguing with the director of this branch of NIH. I said, no, I think I much rather study this intensive 3 months of Vipassana because scientifically we don't know the dose. We need to start somewhere. Let's start with something more powerful. And they say, no, listen, the goal of our institution is not to understand meditation. It is to understand whether complementary and alternative medicine are safe or not, and whether and also we need to know whether they need to be, if they are safe and useful, everyone should use the same program. So that's really, they're coming from as John said, there's some economical reason. They try to manualize one single universal practice, and there have been a lot of attempt to change their vision of that, but it's really because of the funding situation that's really drive a lot of this mindfulness kind of hysteria, in a way.
It's a lot like drug research, pharmaceutical research that can be driven very much by funding as well. Except the difference is that mindfulness researchers don't get Ferraris. That's the only.
We approached NCAM with the Shamatha project, and they said this is incredibly interesting. But our mandate is, what is the person on the street going to go down? If can you give this at the local CVS that they could essentially, where they get their flu shot? Can they learn a little meditation? So no thanks. But it's really interesting.
I just want to avoid a certain misunderstanding. I mean, we're learning that mindfulness becoming the banner of Buddhism, as you've called, this is a highly historically contingent process, something new and recent. In a way, this is irrelevant information. The question is if it's not a good thing, All of this might be a good thing still. Even, it's just the latest development, and it's a result of factors we understand. This doesn't take the burden off our shoulders to decide if we want to further cultivate this and integrate it into our societies. Just because from, say, the perspective of Buddhist historians, this is a very strange and recent event, that there's a question behind it.
I mean, I myself have written a couple of pieces that point out that modern mindfulness, contemporary mindfulness is often presented as somehow completely inauthentic to the Buddhist tradition, and that is absolutely false. There are definitely precedents for the styles of practice that we see in contemporary mindfulness, and there are even theoretical reasons for doing those kinds of practices are quite profoundly developed, you could say, by Indian and Tibetan theorists. So I wouldn't even say that somehow contemporary mindfulness, as some people would say, is some kind of watered-down new invention. That would be false, actually, on my view. But it is the way in which it's become the banner of Buddhism is new. But that, as you point out, that is irrelevant to the question of whether it's a good thing.
But where history might actually be relevant is that I would agree with John that this is not new. You find precedents for it in the past. There's an argument that I've made that it tends to be associated with more lay-oriented traditions. But what is interesting is that it was quite controversial. And again, so everything is controversial. But nonetheless, if we're just getting into this and we're all kind of gung-ho and excited about it, it might be useful to find out what the concerns were among certain Buddhists, you might call them traditionalists, about the dangers or the potential downside. And one of the potential downside was the ethical problems with this. That was very much foregrounded, and that's something that is coming out a lot, that there's something that claimed to be ethically neutral might be in terms of any kind of effort to transform society and so on and so forth. It might neutralize that. So that it's just, this is where I think the historian and kind of getting Buddhism, bringing more of the diversity of the Buddhist tradition to the table might actually inform the way we think about things like mindfulness, because it's not new.
I think one recent development, say in the last 10 years, that suggests that kind of the attraction towards mindfulness is not just funding driven or a fad, is just the amazing way it has caught on in psychotherapy. So the dominant psychotherapy for some time has been cognitive behavioral therapy. It's often recognized that cognitive behavioral therapy works with some people. It's a lot of hard work. It often doesn't work. And what a lot of therapists have discovered is that mindfulness is often a much simpler, more direct way of resolving some of the issues with their clients than using CBT. So that mindfulness has become a standard kind of tool in the toolkit of psychotherapists, because it's easily taught and highly effective. And the way it's typically used is it typically in psychopathologies, there's some kind of dysfunctional thought pattern that gets people into trouble, and CBT would traditionally try to recognize these thoughts and create replacements, inhibit the problematic thoughts, activate the more functional thoughts. But that's really hard work, and what therapists have discovered is that applying mindfulness to these problematic thoughts, in some sense, it disables them so that they don't kind of kind of aggravate the problems that people are having. And I haven't heard anything from that community that using mindfulness in this context is leading to kind of serious problems, or it just seems to be a very simple, basic tool that is extremely effective in disabling problematic mental states.
Can I say something?
Yeah. Can I say something just to that? It seems to me one of the things that made me often uncomfortable in some of the mind and life is that there is a tendency to privilege positive result versus negative result. And I think getting the negative result in the open would be extremely important. So I'm very doubtful about your idea that mindfulness is always beneficial, because I have to assume that this is not the case. I really don't know, but I notice a tendency not to put on the table the negative result, and that troubles me enormously. Like, for example, I would love to hear from Cliff what are the negative results that he found in his study, because I have to assume that there were some.
So the most stable negative result that we got in our whole project was regarding change in fluid intelligence. We gave people the Raven's progressive matrices, and you could build a building on how stable the result was pre to post, and it replicated in both retreats. So I had an idea that maybe some people's fluid intelligence might shift a little. We had measures of personality that shifted, a whole variety of things that did shift. That was an extraordinarily stable non-change. That would be the most stable negative result that we have. I'm sure that there are tons of negative results lurking in the background that we have not yet forwarded.
But I was going to say, where's Willoughby? Willoughby Britton has a whole research program that. Willoughby, you here?
She's at the back. She's at the back.
Could you maybe speak to that?
I haven't forgotten.
I thought that my shortness would make me able to hide from this question. Yes, there are definitely difficulties that arise in practice, even within the clinical context of an 8-week program. I have 2 studies underway on the topic. One is called The Varieties of Contemplative Experience, which, as John pointed out, was called the Dark Night Project, which no one wanted to fund. So we changed it, and now it's funded. But that was just interviewing teachers at the big retreat centers, Spirit Rock, IMS, about what kind of difficulties they've seen either in their own practice or in their students, and then interviewing students that have had various kinds of difficulties. And we're not having any problems finding people in any tradition. We have actually hundreds of people calling us. We have a wait list. And the kinds of things that people are reporting vary a lot, but some of them are quite serious. So we have things like psychosis. About a quarter of our sample get hospitalized. And we have depersonalization is very common. De-repression of traumatic memory is probably the most common. We see that in MBSR, MBCT. Mania. Just a huge range of sort of what you would call energetic problems, even though most people don't believe in that. Feelings, proprioceptive feelings of energy moving through the body, or just body sensations, strange body sensations, those types of things. One of the most disturbing points of data coming from the study is that the average duration of symptoms that are related to impairment in functioning, which we defined as inability to work or take care of children, was more than 3 years. And this is not true in the MBSR group. Those were much more mild, but in this other sample, it was fairly long duration. So, one thing that I wanted to say about this repeated data point that there's never been any adverse effects reported. That's fairly true, but there's also never been adverse effects measured. And if you look at the Goyal meta-analysis, or any of the meta-analyses, or any of the meta-analyses of psychological treatments, period, you'll see that more than 80% of them do not measure adverse effects actively. They're waiting for people to report them. And the demand characteristics of meditation studies in particular, people are not going to report these. And so we find that underreporting is about 20-fold underestimated if you don't ask specific questions about these effects. And so I'm hopefully going to have a meditation experiences questionnaire ready to go so that we can actually go through actually have these experiences, a checklist basically to go through with everyone so that we have something to measure. Because this is a really it's definitely happening and not being reported. So, and then the other thing I wanted to say is that even the term adverse effect is very problematic, in that we actually started calling that the experiences initially adverse effects because that's my clinical orientation. That's how we, very psychopharm kind of orientation towards clinical trials. But certain kinds of experiences, there's no experience that's innately adverse. Many people have a loss of sense of self and they think it's the greatest thing ever. Not many in my sample, but and other people have, it's very, very frightening for them. So the interpretive framework that they come in with is very important in how they interpret a given experience. So I think for me, this is why I'm at this conference, the confluence of these or collision, if you want to call it, of these different life worlds or spaces of meaning are colliding inside people as they take on this practice in one context and have experiences that might be better framed in another context that they've never heard of and never been given. So I think it's all very rich and important for this reason for me.
Could I just say really briefly, there's a very straightforward way to put the question that's come up, a straightforward way to put it vis-a-vis comments from Thomas and then Bob's appeal to the significance of history. Thomas said the real question here is whether these practices are good, and the obvious question there is, good for what? And among the many values in looking to the historical tradition is to get a sense of what they in the tradition thought these practices were for. And there's many hundreds of years of reflection on what the point of these is. And it's seldom described as the relief of stress or making it easier to go back to work on Monday morning after a bad weekend or whatever. And so attention to how the tradition understands the point of this is not insignificant for assessing just what kind of practices these are.
Yeah, and I just want to add a quick point here. This is the point I was trying to make before George jumped in there. It's also useful to, now that we've had the papers and the discussions move forward quite a bit, to disentangle. There seems to be several issues on the table. And I'm reading here the various cues that Bob has sort of reminded us or sort of put them up again and again. And that is, there seems to be three different issues. One is, should we study mindfulness meditation? Well, science studies all sorts of things, so why not study mindfulness meditation, right? I mean, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't study mindfulness meditation, including its adverse effects, which indeed is being done. Should scientists meditate? That's a completely different question. That's almost sort of a normative question and has various risks associated with it. That is that if you're not the kind of scientist that has that kind of practice, perhaps we're not willing to take you at face value, perhaps we're going to cast some sort of doubt. And it seems to me that science has made the progress it has made, often, right, completely disregarding the personal history and the character of the scientist, right? I mean, we really don't want to hold scientists accountable on moral grounds when we judge the veracity of their research. And then besides all this, there is the issue of Buddhism. Exactly what role does Buddhism, the intellectual history of Buddhism, its philosophy, play in this? And I want to say that the role it plays, it's echoing a point that Dunne has just now made, that it acts as a corrective. That is, if you look at the history oftentimes is a good judge of why is it that certain practices were not privileged, what luminaries, what important figures in those traditions had to say about the role that those practices play. And I think that that's a very important role that the Buddhism as it's sort of as a worldview, as a philosophically sophisticated scholastic tradition does have to play in this, in if not mediating this conversation, at least moderating the conversation. I think Bob has done a wonderful job in moderating it. So.
Yeah, just wanted to jump one more thing onto what Willoughby and I have talked about this, but there is a term in East Asia for the deleterious effects of meditation. It's called chambing, or meditation illness, zembyo. And it's an old term. It's difficult to figure out what exactly they're talking about. Sometimes it looks like a certain kind of self-absorption verging on depression, but I have a feeling it was used much more generically for a wide range, just whenever things went wrong. But specifically, at least in the Sung period, when it becomes to be used quite widely, it's generally directed toward what is called silent illumination techniques. In other words, they're precisely the techniques that look closest to what we talk about as mindfulness. And that's where it's the inactivity of those techniques, the depersonalization associated with a kind of retreat from the social life world that they see as problematic.
I just wanted to underscore that because to me, there's a lesson to be learned from this already, even without having the multiple studies and the meta-analysis, which is that there is great malleability of the brain and of the personal experience through some of these methods, and that their meaning and their consequences depends on the extended context in which they're experienced. So to say we could just find out what they are as such, as though we could just put somebody in a scanner, have them do this, and we're learning something that is independent of the expectations the person came into the situation with, what they're doing while they're practicing and what they do with it afterward, is quite incorrect, I think. It's a misunderstanding of these things from the get-go, and it should lead to a different kind of work. And it pertains very well to our understanding of psychotherapy, which is that although we do very punctual things, what matters is not what happens in that moment. What matters is how the person makes use of it when they walk out of the consulting room and goes back into their everyday life. And that depends not just on them, but on the people around them. Having a psychodynamic insight into your life may do a lot of good for you if you now have a narrative that many people around you value very much, and they find it very interesting for you when you talk about all the things you've suffered. The other point to be made is that nowadays there's this sort of third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy that borrows a lot of other techniques, acceptance, commitment therapy, lots of other things that are taking other elements out of Buddhist practice, motivated by attitudes, ethical attitudes, and other kinds of things. So, but the key thing for me is that there's already a lot of evidence that would fit with our notion of the importance of context in shaping experience in some way, and that's what we should be studying, not this sort of illusory extracting a moment out of the stream of some kind of stable life experience.
So can I briefly follow up on this? So what I hear in some of the comments is that some people seem to be asking for actually a politically active Buddhism, whatever that is. And what I perceive is that the superficial hysterical movement out there is already very politically active, the mindfulness industry that is forming out there. And this kind of asks the question if the experts should take on an obligation of becoming politically active themselves against this very superficial movement here in any way. Is that what you have in mind, or is this an obligation we have to kind of publicly step out and say things like, this is going too far, or this is not going far enough?
Well, I mean, do you mean to suggest that we should be the cops at Woodstock and really police the?
Yeah.
Okay.
Am I hearing this, or am I not hearing this in your comments? Isn't that what we're doing? We're just having this little discussion.
You really think anyone's going to take us seriously? I mean, in a way, I'm not sure that this is. My own view is it is not our job to control or even manage the way in which Buddhist practices, whether they're extracted from Buddhism or still embedded within some kind of a Buddhist framework, are going to be appropriated into our culture. Since if we try to do that, we will fail in any case. What we can do is point out what is the larger context in which that's happening. We can make available perspectives that may be helpful for persons who are wondering why there's a blonde woman on the front of Time magazine. But I don't think I'm not even saying that it's better or worse. I mean, I think Thomas's question is a very good one. Maybe it's perfectly fine for mindfulness to spread in this fashion. And I'm not sure that I'm in a position to know whether that's true or not. But I do think there's a responsibility to point out what its history is, how similar practices, when they were used previously in Buddhism, what the concerns, as Bob pointed out, were, what the importance of a larger context is. One way of thinking about adverse effects, for example, is that the descriptions of those states in classical Buddhist texts describe them as derealization, depersonalization, looks just like that. But they are not experienced in that fashion because there's a conceptual preparation and a conceptual interpretation afterward. There's a kind of context. And maybe that's, what prevents those from becoming adverse effects. So that's the kind of thing we can point out. But the idea that anyway, I am not going to stand up here and tell people what they can or can't do, whether they can or can't practice mindfulness or what have you. I just don't presume to do that.
I do think that at least for folks doing empirical work, which can be reported in the popular press, there is an ethical responsibility to, as much as possible, engage any communicator to the public as deeply as possible on regards the overinterpretation of scientific results. I mean, this is, I think, a very important public responsibility of scientists. We take it very seriously, and I give reporters often an extremely hard time, and try to engage them for hours and hours when they want, 5 minutes.
I want to bring some other people in because there's a number of people who would like to have the opportunity to ask questions. Are going to take 2 more questions, and I'm sorry to the people who have questions, but just the time is limited. So I know there was one back here. So.
Okay. So thanks. My head is really buzzing with ideas and questions after this conference. It's been very rich, I think, and fruitful. And so I'll extract the worry that I have about the way phenomenology has been portrayed, especially, I guess, in some of the talks with, and its relation to Buddhism and, on the other hand, cognitive science. And that is, at least in Husserlian phenomenology, if you look at that, what's called transcendental, and also he adds another really important word he calls eidetic, which means it's supposed to be after essences. It's supposed to be after very high-level kinds of invariants that you find about consciousness. Not a bunch of specific things that make us different from one another when we introspect. Not stuff that's private, not stuff that's hidden, but it's stuff that you find by reasoning, by reason. That's Ida, by looking for Ida, and he has a whole method for that. That's supposed to show us what kinds of things we're supposed to arrive at that are actually you can't actually deny if you accept the concepts involved. So an example of that would be something like the fact that belief exhibits intentionality. So the claim would be there that that's a very high-level kind of statement, and you can't have a belief that's not about something. That's supposed to be that's supposed to be a contradiction, as it were, a finding of reason. You can't have a belief about that's not about something. So if you ask somebody, if somebody tells you they have a belief, and you say, well, about what? And they say, nothing in particular. I'm just believing. He sees that as that's a material kind of countersense, a material contradiction. It's not a report of introspection. So what he's after anyway, is, as he often puts it, is not stuff that's derived from or depends on experience, but actually stuff that, the other way around, stuff that experience depends upon. that is conditions, a priori, that is necessary conditions, things you can't deny. So there wouldn't be like an experiment that could show you that belief doesn't exhibit intentionality, that could test that. It does or doesn't exhibit intentionality. Because the only thing that could happen there is that you must be changing the meaning of the word belief. Because there can't be something like belief that's not about. And then I see the connection with, the connection with Buddhism is similar. I mean, a lot of things that I see anyway when I read Buddhist texts is that at least there's a strain of work running through it in which the Buddhists are also trying to find things that make experience possible. Not things that are derived from sensory experience, as it were, scientific findings, but things that make reversing it. Kant called that a Copernican revolution, where we turn it around, things that make experience possible. And what would those be? Well, those would be things like, in conventional consciousness, things like object-directedness, and in phenomenology, you can make a big list of these things. There's a whole list of things that Husserl thinks are all eidetic results. And in Buddhism, you see, it seems, at least in parts of Buddhism, you also see, you see an appeal to this kind of thing because, it's, like, for example, the reasoning of that leads to the claim that objects are empty of inherent existence, so dependent arising. There's a whole logic of dependence-independence there that's involved in that kind of reasoning. And that logic, I think, is not something that the Buddhists would say, well, that's derived from experience, that kind of logic of those kinds of relationships. It's rather the other way around. A lot of things that seem to be like that in Buddhism. So it's called the dependent arising. I know some traditions, it's called the king of reasons. It's got to do with reasoning, not just with saying, I've got a pain in my toe right now, you can't feel it, so that's subjective, that's first person. You're not going to get any science started on that basis, but you might be able to get these. So anyway, that's my worry about the way phenomenology's been portrayed, and I just okay, so if there's a comment or response to it.
Can I say a thing or two? Mm-hmm. All right. So yeah, I mean, we barely. I think Evan touched on that in his plenary talk yesterday by laying out the various conceptions of phenomenology, right? So Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, but also sort of Merleau-Ponty's project, Heidegger's project. So there, and phenomenology has undergone extraordinary diversification. So we talk about a social phenomenology, we talk about obviously the existential project. So it seems as though, so my immediate response is that there's just not one phenomenology as Husserl conceived it, that we use phenomenology in a much broader sense. But I understand your worries about the transcendental part of that project. That is that when we try to that there are certain invariants about exactly what makes the possibility of experience, right? In other words, there are certain invariants about how thought operates regardless of assumptions about what is and it isn't the case, that is what is and isn't real. And well, that's precisely what sort of the noematic content of thought is precisely what the phenomenological method is supposed to disclose to us. And some of us here have argued that there is a similar movement within Buddhism itself, that is what the likes of perhaps Dinagan Dharmakirti and some other Buddhist philosophers, at least in India, are doing just that. They're trying to figure out exactly what it is about the structure of awareness that is invariant. And we had a long debate about this one key term, this vasamvedana, the self-awareness, or the reflexive nature of awareness, and whether that itself is part of the intentional structure of awareness, where it's more basic, or it itself an indication of exactly how awareness operates. But make no mistake, the Buddhists too recognized that there, at least some of them, that's one of the invariants of consciousness is indeed its intentional structure. At least some of us have argued that. There's a debate there too. So what I want to say is that the reason why I may have come across as we're not being quite truthful to the phenomenological traditions, because we just don't have the time to go into all those details. But trust us, those of us who do write in that area provide you with ample details. So feel free to go and explore.
And if I can just follow up, you can look at a chapter that we wrote with John Dunne when John came out with a nice figure when he clearly make a relationship between certain style of practice in the Tibetan tradition and some eidetic invariant in experience, in particular subject-object distinctions, and we have in Madison we collect some data where we try to investigate the neural correlate of on the one hand state that involve a subject-object duality, and on the other hand practice that claim to have some form of non-duality, and so that could be a first steps to maybe characterize some neural correlate of these phenomenological invariants. But as it was said, it's rather technical debate, and so we didn't have time to go into details here.
We're going to take...
Can I just say something? That there is a way to turn it the other way around, which is that to take this invariance as kind of putative candidate for invariance and maybe develop some empirical research to know whether they're really invariants or not. So I think that's a very interesting point, but whether it goes from transcendental to science or science to what's putatively thought to be transcendental, that's a big can of worm.
We're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to ask Bob to say as the convener, the closing words that need to be said. So just to let you know.
Thanks, Evan. Okay. I wanted to offer a historical angle on this problem of how the mindfulness problem is perceived by the broad public. And I just wanted to comment first that there is a very clear sense of disdain, well-earned disdain, perhaps, for what is happening in terms of the popular press and how this is perceived outside of this particular life world. I've had the opportunity to observe the mind and life relationship with the popular press, with the broader public from its very, very beginnings. And that disdain was there long before the mindfulness problem manifested in what we see today. And a lot of it manifested in its time in very functional and well thought out ideas like keeping the press out of the meeting rooms. It's shifted over time. But I think we should give a little bit of thought reflexively to how we've contributed to this problem and think about how we can fix it along the lines of what Cliff was talking about. But I think we hold some responsibility for this situation. So.
As a former board member of the Mind and Life Institute, now, well, I won't go into further details about that, but I will say that there is, and you know as well as I do, that it's a complex relationship. There's a desire to promote certain types of practices and even certain ethical norms in our culture, concerns about the direction of our culture, what I find legitimate concerns, in most of which I share, and a dance that needs to happen where it's clear that there are certain types of, if you like, cultural hooks, where notions such as mindfulness can spread like wildfire through our culture, a kind of virus almost, that is, for which we are an easy host. And if we can allow that to run and see what benefit there might be from it, but there are choices that are made when one does that, to not say certain kinds of things. And I agree, I completely agree, and perhaps I am even myself personally complicit that there are times when maybe I could have said something that might have been more corrective. So I take to heart very much what you have said. On the other hand, as Thomas, just to go back to what Thomas has said, it is in some ways the fact that that we're such a good host for this somewhat tailored virus, if you like, as sort of a decontextualized mindfulness itself is fascinating. I don't mean to perform an experiment on our entire culture, but it is, who knows what might come of it. The responsibility, though, part of the issue of the responsibility is also that there can be a hubris, right? That we can seem as if we somehow have this privileged position and we're going to declare what is and is not mindfulness. And that has been a tremendously unhelpful aspect of the discussion around mindfulness. The very notion that there is an authentic version of Buddhist mindfulness, to my mind, is simply false. And that's not the place to start. So that way of responding to the issue has also been, in many ways, problematic.
So in the spirit of what we have learned, which is to acknowledge our social embeddedness and entanglements, I want to again acknowledge our Dhanapati, the Robert Ho Foundation and the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai. I also really want to thank Sanjot Mahendale, who put all this together, all of the participants, many of whom have come from far away, the audience. You've been extremely patient sitting through a very long day. And should this event have garnered any merit, may it be dedicated to the awakening of all sentient and insentient beings.
I want to thank Evan on behalf of all of the presenters. I want to thank Bob and Evan for an extraordinary meeting preparation, and it's a real privilege to be in this present company. Thank you so much.